All right, everybody, welcome and thank you for joining us. We're going to be getting started in just about 15 seconds. We're waiting for our attendees to drop in. So stand by. We're going to get started in just a minute or two. All right, looks like all of our attendees are coming in. Hopefully they will continue to come in as we go. I want to thank everyone for joining us. It looks like we're ready to get started. So I'm going to stop screen sharing and kick it over to our speakers to begin. All right, James, all you.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this session, which is on disruption and leapfrogging to a better future coming out of COVID. So this is a really interesting subject, and we've got a great panel here for you today. Just to get things started, I'm James Bernard. I'm the Vice President for Resonance. We're a boutique consultancy focused at the intersection of global business and global development. And I head up our impact advisory service. It's focused on companies, foundations, and NGOs and helping them better connect with development actors to achieve common outcomes in emerging markets. On a personal note, I grew up in Kenya and have worked extensively in Africa. So I've seen the power of local innovation and the power of the effect of leapfrogging in emerging markets. And I'm really excited about this panel. It's something I'm very much passionate about. As we all know, 2020 has been a year of disruption like no other year any of us have seen in our lifetimes. But it's also an interesting opportunity to rethink the systems, the tools, the technologies that may have constrained us in the past. And as I said a moment ago, emerging markets have always had a way of driving their own innovation. Think about some of the innovations we've seen in the last few years, from M-Pesa for mobile money to off-grid solar to new forms of financing, including microfinance. So we've seen many of these approaches scale from one market to another, but we still have more to do as global development practitioners in fostering local innovation, skills, and financing, and making sure that those systems scale across markets and that are contextually appropriate to the markets where they work. So in this morning's panel, we will explore what might come next as we move into a post-COVID world. Are we going to be able to build the systems that will be more sustainable, more equitable to the people in the markets, more appropriate and contextual to the places where they live? So I'm very excited to be able to moderate this panel. We've got three excellent panelists here. Rachel Cardone, who's Deputy Director of Water, Health, and Development at the Stanford Woods Institute. Atul Tandon, who is the CEO of Opportunity International. And Matthew Harris, the Director of Business Development for Latin America at Solar Energy International. So we're going to come at this from a few different angles. We had a very lively discussion as we prepared for this last week, and I'm sure this will be a very lively discussion as well. We'll probably have the panelists talk for about 40 minutes or so, and then we'll open up the floor for questions from the audience. And so please shoot any questions that you have into the Q&A pane. I'll monitor those and I'll try to pick out themes and make sure we get those questions answered as well. So very excited to have this discussion. So maybe to kick things off, and I'll just ask this question of everybody on the panel, and we can see where the answers lie. So COVID has shut down the global supply chains and has caused just massive economic crisis in all parts of the world, and in many ways just contained markets to within their borders. And most regions of the world are going to have to rebuild in 2021 and beyond. And we've seen, as I said, these technologies in emerging markets really begin to emerge and leapfrog over developments in the West, partly because there's a non-linear sort of development or technology development process in emerging markets. So I'm curious from the panelists, do you think that beyond COVID is going to be a leapfrogging opportunity. I'm guessing you do because you're on this panel. But more importantly, why do you think it's a leapfrogging opportunity? So I'll open it up to whomever wants to speak first. Just remember to take yourself off of mute. Don't all jump at once.
I'll jump in, James. Thanks. It's really great to be here and with the panel. And this is my first Goalmakers, so stay easy on me, right? But yeah, this is a yes for me for sure. I keep coming back to the constant in this, which is that climate change is real, and it's the biggest test of humanity, and it's not going away in a few years. So in many ways, we need the urgency and the different ways of doing things to solve this. I think we all know that, humanity really has no choice. And something that I've taken from COVID-19 is this idea of having compassion and care for one another. This year has shown this interconnectedness of all species. It's challenged humans to be reflective and ask ourselves the hard questions about our existence with each other and decisions and policies that we make. So I've been thinking about what if we came together to leapfrog the current ways of how we relate to each other, from class to race to policies and decision making at the highest levels, and connect on a shared equitable vision for all species for all time. What if that starts to become the leapfrog? And I'm getting the sense that we're starting to see that. We're starting to see each other again and think more clearly about what we need to be doing as a humanity. And start to sort of dismantle those forces that keep people down, and ask the question of who do we need to bring along in this vision. So absolutely, we need governments making the right now, when we think about the short term related to COVID, making these economic recovery plans to make that recovery more productive while thinking about the long term. We need to be taking advantage of economic recovery plans to introduce measures to accelerate renewable energies and comply with commitments to sustainable development and climate goals. So, slowing this pace of COVID and maintaining our goals, specifically in the topic here of SDGs, it's not going to be the work of governments alone, right? It requires an all of society response. And I think it's just time for us to start leapfrogging the old ways of how we relate to each other, how we make decisions and policies, put equity and compassion at the center of our roadmap.
That's great. And partnerships are a theme I'm going to come back to. It's a lot of what I do in my daily life. And I think it is going to be critical as we go forward. Atul, I saw that you started to speak as well.
Thanks, Jim. Atul, Tandon, Opportunity International. And similar to James, didn't grow up in Kenya, but obviously India. And in fact, came to the US with the Citibank. They transferred me from their Indian operation. So in the 90s. James, the group that I was part of and reporting out the decent work and economic growth, when we met, focused on SDG 8, what ties that group together is really a focus on, all right, poverty elevation, right? Poverty is principally in many ways, the first definition is economics, so the solution's got to be economics. So how do you grow jobs? And, and then you asked me, actually preparing for this, the biggest question that the group also landed on is, all right, what is the biggest elephant in the room that we all have come to recognize part of COVID-19? And the biggest elephant is the informal economy, right? Is the invisible sector of people who are outside the formal economy. Now, I gave you a number of about 700 million when we were preparing. I have to tell you that I was off by about a third. ILO estimates 2 billion people are in the informal economy. 2 billion, 61.2% of the world's employed population. So when you start to look at it, and what we all also realized was that what COVID is in a short span of just about 9 months now, forced us to recognize is, all right, who are these people? How do we now engage them? And that the solutions that we have so far developed, including microfinance, the industry that I'm part of, at the end of about 25 years, 400 million people in the financial inclusion and organized sectors, they are not enough. And the solutions will be, and we'll talk briefly about it, is how do you deploy high tech, but in a high touch fashion? And how do you massively leverage, and we'll talk about both, massively leverage partner relationships so that more capital gets released and and these right solutions are delivered to the right people at the right time. But I think we are in a time where, frankly, my industry is having to rethink, and I think we actually are making progress, pretty rapid progress, on our entire solution set. So it really is, in some ways, best of times and the worst of times. Right? The necessity is the mother of invention, and here we are.
There's never been more necessity or opportunity for invention than we have right now. Good point. Rachel.
So, no, this is great because I can, when you wait to be last, you can kind of piggyback on what the other people have said. So so to your point, Matthew, so I was part of the SDG 6, so the clean water or the safe water, safely managed water, right, initiative. And one of the things that we grappled with in the way that we structured that discussion was around the kind of built environment versus the greenfield environment. And, when you look at demographics, you see that actually, and again, I should have the statistic right here at my fingertips, but I don't. But an incredible population is, the cities haven't even been built yet, right, for the 21st century to house the population, which, what we see in sub-Saharan Africa is that a lot of these cities are growing and it's informal areas, right? So you don't have density, you don't have economies of scale happening in terms of services. So you have, the need for water, right? We do need to disrupt and leapfrog current solutions. And when I thought about, what you were saying, Matthew, about climate change, the built environment is responsible for a tremendous amount of carbon emissions, right? So we have this opportunity where you have populations moving into cities, or maybe actually in higher income, now that everybody's working remotely, maybe people are going to now, like where I live, right? I left Seattle and live in the forest. Well, I'm part of the problem too, right? But you have this regionalization of and distribution happening within cities, but you also then have urbanization happening in other parts of the world. How do we actually provide water, not just for human health, but also for industry, right? And for just making sure that everybody can live a sustainable lifestyle. And that's a huge challenge. And one of the things that I find problematic, right, is that the economics don't work of the current model. Just the capital costs to get people a piped network it's just really high. I don't know where that money comes from, because there's not a private sector value proposition really for utility water. But also the to your point, Atul, about you have informal economy and a lot of people who are, previously bottom of the pyramid or whatever you want to call, but populations that can't really pay for private sector bottled water. It doesn't work. So these are some of the conundrums that we're grappling with in the water space. How do we protect the environment? How do we serve humanity with respect to water? And there are no easy answers. And so this is where it's kind of fun now to grapple, because if there aren't any easy answers, we kind of need to talk about market structure. And I think this is a wonderful opportunity for us to really rethink aid and rethink the way development practice happens. For all of us who have been grounded and not on an airplane for 9 months, I think it's a humbling experience and offers a lot of opportunity for reflection about what value we're adding, like what are we all doing? So I'll leave it at that.
Great. I think that's a good transition to a question I had for Matt, which, and it relates to the business models and the sort of comparison between water and solar and renewable energy. And, we've seen this broad movement towards solar, both domestically and internationally over the last decade and a half. And mainly driven by the price of components coming down and the availability of solar. So my question is, what makes the value proposition for solar energy so effective? Maybe say a little bit more about what your organization does within that ecosystem, and what have you seen as the most replicable business models in solar in Latin America and beyond?
Great. Yeah, thanks for that question, James. It's a valuable, important one. And just briefly before I touch on Solar Energy International, the work that we did here as part of Roundtable, in Denver at the Posner Center for International Development touched on SDG 7 and 13 and access to energy. And of course, renewables was part of that. At Solar Energy International, we were formed in 1991 here in Colorado, where I'm at, by a group of educators. And they were passionate about empowering people to use renewable energy in their lives through the delivery method of training, technical training, as well as technical assistance around the world. And today our core focus is on that technical training for the solar industry. We have programs right now, both in English and Spanish languages, focusing mostly on people who want to like design, install, and maintain solar electric systems. And you know, for us, our teaching methodology is rooted in theoretical and experiential hands-on learning. Right, we take you from the classroom into the field of practice, and really underneath our mission and our vision is like we're all about human capital. We can see that there will be a need for more entrepreneurs and more trained workers to deliver renewable energy solutions, right? So when you think about solving energy poverty and climate change, it's all about building the technical and business skill sets in our communities and providing those pathways of learning. So some of the ways that we've been effective at doing this, one is really having our feet in the needs of the solar industry, being very active with the industry on many different levels so that we understand where the growth opportunities are, where the innovations are coming or will be coming, and that helps us inform the design and delivery of our curriculum. Another really big thing was the development of online learning platforms. And it's given us a strong global reach. And I think this is an area where we have to start looking, okay, like how do you bring online education to even more of a population where maybe there isn't already access to internet or electricity? Are there ways to solve that or other ways to attack training? But we need to build these sort of localized training regimes. And part of that also ties to another thing we've been doing, which is creating localized training centers, right, where we can get into the hands-on practice and the belief of using this equipment, seeing how the technology works, proving it to ourselves and then to our communities, and growing knowledgeable technical practitioners, if you will. And then, as we've touched on, partnerships are so key, right? We know that. So we work with universities, NGOs, local community groups, governments, to try to help them accelerate pathways of education and training. And so those are some of the things that we've been doing for the last 29 years or so. And now we're looking at how we leverage these lessons learned over the years and collaborate on a coordinated effort to develop workforce programs and new ways to deliver content, providing pathways, as I say, for people country by country, to meet the goal of achieving energy for all. And to the point of like models that we're seeing working, there's a lot out there, right, that we see. It's really interesting to see the development of microgrids and distributed renewable energy resources and see how they're providing opportunities for resiliency and new business models for delivering energy, like sort of the new utility of the future. And then there's a couple other approaches that have been really interesting. Like, for example, Power for All's work in India, where they had a situation where India had sort of on paper met all of their electrical distribution needs. But, there was this idea of like, well, why would we need to do distributed renewable energy systems if we met that need? And Power for All worked on sort of an outreach media campaign, right? And they framed it around spotlighting, okay, what's your country's non-energy related goals? When you look at healthcare, increasing income for farmers, creating green jobs, clean cooking, et cetera. And this was done through a myriad of media communication, job reporting, coordinated government working groups, and the like. And it created this awareness, which was something that came out of our roundtable of like consumer awareness, awareness among decision makers that these solutions bring economic advantages and they solve other non-energy related goals. And that's how we connect to the other SDGs. So I think distributed renewable energy resources open that window for that. And again, there's a lot of different models out there. payment system models and things like that. But you said this at the beginning, James, and I'll close with this, is that it really comes down to, what is the localized value and need? Understanding kind of like what Rachel, you're getting to a little bit on built environment. What is the story of place? And how do we find solutions that relate to the people there on the ground, to their economic situation, et cetera, that are going to bring value? Because there are a tremendous amount of really good technological advancements that we can be deploying today.
Yeah, and I think you touched on a couple of themes there that I'm sure we'll come back to around how do you give people employability and the skills to be employable, and then how do you finance on small scale entrepreneurs who then can go take those skills and start small businesses to support solar in whatever form it might be, as well as partnerships and business models and some of the financing behind that. A really interesting program. And I think we see a lot of development programs that do a lot of training and capacity building, but then there's not the back end of that. How do you actually deliver the impact on that? And I think by, it's giving people skills, and then it's giving them the opportunity to use those skills in a way that drives economic growth and change in their own communities. Rachel, and I know you talked a little bit about this in your intro, but there's so much that's happened in renewable energy. Water is a different environment. It's much more complex because the municipalities are involved. You're talking about house-based or home-based water. You're talking about industrial or health water for health facilities. What are some of the barriers that are in place today in water, and what can be learned from renewable energy?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So I'm just, it's like, of course, your head sort of spins with all these different examples. I think, couple of quick challenges is one, model. There's a model. There's an organization called Water 4 that's doing some really interesting work funded by the Hilton Foundation in Ghana, where, they've managed to scale, from I think that they're almost at 90% of a district population, so 100,000 people in 2 years, right? They provide kiosks, safe water at point of purchase, right? So, and that's amazing, right? It's an amazing story of scale. It's aided by some technology. They're embedding in payment system and like learning a lot from the renewable energy sector. But when you ask them how much are people consuming of this water that they're buying, it's less than a liter per capita per day. And do we know, is that, so then clearly like they're using alternative water sources for the rest of their water uses. Do you get the health impact? Do you get the economic impact, right? Of having that water there in the first place? And that's something that the teams are scrambling, right? That's like their number one problem to solve, right? And it's exciting to see them grapple with that. But this issue of alternative water source, right? People, in the water sector, yes, we're increasingly seeing water scarcity from a security, like the absolute lack of water is an issue in a lot of contexts. But for the most part, there's this variance between what we might think as safe and what people are comfortable drinking, And so that, to pay for water and the payment culture is a big barrier to scale. I also think that the distributed models, are where to go, right? And kind of things where you can pick up the assets. One of the big challenges with water is that a lot of the assets are fixed. And if you put in a utility network, they're buried, so even if for existing utilities, nobody knows where the pipe, there's a large section of grids that people don't know where the pipes are. That's true in this country too, right? It's not just a low-income country problem. So trying to figure out how to distribute water without having buried fixed assets that can't be recouped, right, is really important. And the other thing is, I think a lot of business model innovation is required. To be honest, I think when I was at Gates many years ago, I mentioned this on the prep call, I funded a grant to actually categorize what are the business models, what are the delivery models for water. And the sector still doesn't have those, right? It was one of those things that got pushed back against. We have community managed schemes, and then we have utilities, and then there are these, safe water enterprises or, social entrepreneurs in the middle. But there's no actual what does that actually look like in terms of business models? And I had done research on that early in my career, but there's no formalized thing where then as an investor, you could go in and say, I'm investing in this, or I'm looking at this, where you have standardized due diligence, at least for, for the science part of due diligence. Obviously, investing is an art form too, but just, there's not that kind of framework for channeling investments. So we don't know, there are assumptions. We assume that community managed schemes are unsuccessful, but some of them are, some of them manage to be able to, keep those hand pumps running for decades at a time. Most of them fail, but it's one of these things where we need to be better organized and thinking more as a service industry to others. And that's going to be my last point. And this question is, and I'm curious because you're renewable, Matt, and with microfinance, Atul, there's this element, there's this sort of like kernel I've been trying to push and nobody's listened to me in the last couple of years, which is I feel like the water sector institutionally, it's like there's a ministry of water, and then, there's a ministry of irrigation, and there's a ministry of health, and a lot of actually the people who use water that we want healthcare facilities to have water. It's shocking that, 80+% in most countries of healthcare facilities, like they don't have safe water, right? It's crazy. Schools are like abysmal when it comes to safe water for students, but yet the water sector comes and sees itself as an equal rather than as like kind of being client focused. They assume that the healthcare facility, like they're not responsible, sort of, ministries of water are only responsible for households. They're not actually providing services, but they want to be equal to health and ed or other social sectors institutionally. They don't actually, right? I don't know if this makes sense, but there's something about, could we shift toward a more client focus and have a different kind of relationship internally within government? I think is also, that like, because the current institutional structure is also a massive barrier to scale. And I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, some excellent points in there. And we've certainly seen, over the course of decades, development being much more driven by where the funding comes from and sort of the silos of the funding rather than what the people on the ground actually need. And I think as we talk about innovations, it's not just technology innovations or engineering innovations, but it's also maybe innovations in where the financing comes from and how it serves the people that we try to serve. And how do we hear their voices back into the conversation? Because so often they're not a part of the conversation. Atul, that number you gave out at the beginning of your introductory remarks blows me away even more than the number we talked about in the prep meeting, that there are so many people who are so reliant on informal economies here around the world, and certainly anybody who's traveled overseas has seen these in action, and the amount of money that must pass through those is in the probably trillions or tens of trillions of dollars. And so what can be done from the financing angle, and what can donors, governments, development banks, private investors do to unlock some of the capital that's out there to help people who are at the very bottom of the pyramid, who are working in informal economies and don't have a safety net?
Thanks, James. Thanks. I'm going to pick up on a couple of the themes that both Matthew and Rachel spoke about, and Matthew got us off on the right track of the partners and people and places, right? Solutions have to be relevant to people who are in a specific place, and the place and the people sort of determine what kind of solutions will be effective. But to deliver them on scale, you need local partners. And as I heard Rachel speak about her industry, the view which I share very strongly, that you've got to deliver. The different players have to come together and really deliver integrated level of services. Ultimately, it is the household, the person who is our principal client. All right, ministries of from the government ministries, if they're looking at infrastructure development and justice and equity, the private sector is looking at, okay, how do we immobilize and invest capital, if you will, and the NGO sector starts to go down and look at integrated delivery at the household level. One of the big things we've learned in the microfinance industry, which I'm part of today, is to your point, James, you need really three things to work together for a household to get out of poverty and stay sustainable. Is they need to have the resources to deploy so they can earn a living, skills or financial resources, and they need to have the right set of skills, and they need to have the right set of support, right? You need all three to work together. And I think as we look at the NGO sector, that's what we see us kind of moving towards, is how do we deploy all those three interventions: resources, skills, and support. So I'll give you an example to your question of a massive deployment of capital. I'll use my own organization, Opportunity Example International, to illustrate the point. We've been in the microfinance business for a while. And, at the end of about, let's say about 25 years of work, we've got, $3 billion deployed globally, about 17 million clients who have of whom 12 million are savers, close to $500 million of savings, all of that. The effective leverage that we have, I'll take our bank in Ghana, it's about 4:1, right? We've deployed about $50 million of capital into that bank. And in turn, they have deployed about $200 million of loans out to the bottom of the pyramid, their clients. They've got about $500,000 between loans and savings. A few years back, we said, all right, is there a different way to, if we want to massively increase capital deployed, which is our specific objective, how do you get massive amounts of capital into the hands deployed to serve the poor in that triad of solutions? We tried a partner heavy and asset light model, and we started with education finance. I won't go into detail, but just to say that our focus, our model has changed to where we are essentially using our expertise and our philanthropic capital to get local lenders to give loans to school proprietors and to families to both build and renovate schools and to send kids to school at the affordable schools at the bottom of the pyramid children. That model, remember my model, best of class on banking is 4:1 leverage. Our education finance model this year, 18:1 leverage. We have so far invested just about $2.5 million or so in budgets, small amount, already released $104 million of local capital, 61 financial institutions in 24 countries. Why are they doing it? Because we are coming alongside and giving them the lending expertise, in effect helping them to manage their lending portfolios. And on the other hand, working with school proprietors on a massive, very well organized focus on improving education quality, right? So you put all these things together and you've got now, this year alone, we'll add about 2.2 million children who were not receiving education to receiving education. At to the donor an effective cost of $2.5 million. Now that's what I call massive, scaling. So how do you take that and apply that to agricultural finance? How do you take that and apply that to water? How do you take that and apply those models to solar? I think that's where sort of in our minds the future lies, and we collectively start to move towards that. Finally, I would say is that how do you, and we can talk about that in Q&A, how do you deliver these things in a high touch and high tech manner, so that the cost of delivery at the coalface at the very bottom of the pyramid is reduced. So I'll pause there, but lots to celebrate in terms of the innovations that currently the industry is going through.
So just following up on that for anybody in the panel, I mean, they're really good, interesting examples there of local development happening, local financing happening with assistance from international organizations that drive scaled local change or scaled change in the case of education at a much lower cost than we see with many development programs, where you might have a 2.5 million program from a donor, $2.5 million program from a donor that reaches a very small segment of a very small country. And how do you sort of scale that even larger? How would any of you propose to donors to change the way that they do their programming to allow these kinds of programs at the local level to scale more effectively?
I'll just jump in a little bit. I think that there's a tremendous role specifically with technology around mapping and visualizing data. And however, what we've seen, at least in the water sector, is just decades now of building donor funded databases via NGOs, where the NGOs then house the data in a government office. And then as soon as the funding runs out, the database is cold. right? And so there's not a clear sort of value. And it's not necessarily that government officials in lower income countries don't value the data or the visualization, but there's no budget for it. And so I think that when, if we're going to talk about partnership, there's a real role for the development community to partner with government agencies and, to say, what's the information we actually need from a regulatory perspective, right? And what kind of information do we need from an investment perspective, and actually build a database that's a shared set of data. And maybe this is pie in the sky, but, with clear assumptions, transparency, where people can then refer to that, when they're making investment decisions. And I think of things like the IUCN Red List, right? I think of like the 10K forms that all companies have to submit to the SEC. Like, there are actually examples of that, right? Where you have a piece of data, because what you have is you have just completely different accounting systems, depending on which enterprise you're using. Nobody's using the same set of data, donor in, donor out, NGO in, NGO out, and there's no kind of shared understanding of what the heck is going on. So that's I think a real opportunity on which then, if you think of that as an anchor, then these service providers, if everybody is kind of using and challenging and improving and all that kind of stuff, I'm not saying that we become like the totalitarian ministry of whatever, right? But like that there's actually an opportunity to stop from this kind of start and then end and then not learn, where everything is a bespoke learning opportunity, where you kind of can then have a platform on which you can build things. And there's much more opportunity for funding, for affiliate programs, for all sorts of things. I don't know. So I'll throw that in as an opportunity. And please tell me that's terrible, or, tell me that's great, and let's do it.
Matt, Atul, what do you think?
Yeah, it's interesting. Two thoughts are running through my mind. One, when it comes to sort of the deployment of energy services, electricity, let's say. I think proving the model in ways that you can get funders and policymakers and decision makers to be involved all the way through, seeing it work, connecting with those that you're bringing light to, for example, and sort of proving it. I think brings about a better, stronger connection to the need for the work. As I was saying earlier, tying it to other non-energy related needs too can maybe help drive some more stuff there. But something that came up in my mind when Atul was talking, and this is like two of the challenges that we're seeing in our work related to workforce training, is the people who need the training the most, those who are going to be the workforce of the future deploying renewable energy systems in our communities around the world. They don't have a pathway sort of in front of them that says, hey, you can get certified in this, get a degree, or get some kind of, here's an educational pathway to a job. Those aren't really fully formulated, and they also can't afford to take these trainings. And they look at, what it costs to go through an entire thing to be job ready, so to speak. And so what are the ways in which we can start connecting with decision makers who create, say, certification programs or pathways of training that lead to jobs, like Atul was saying earlier? We need that at the end. And how can we ensure that the funding is there for them, to do that? One model that came out recently, now it's related to not the informal working class, but those who are in the sort of the tax structure, that if you're out of a job, they're working on and getting the financing to pay 100% for someone's workforce training in a completely new discipline. So you lost your job here and you want to transfer to go, to renewables. And so they're finding the funding through various different sources to fund that. And then when these people get their training, that funding goes to the training provider. They get their training, they get a job at the end of it. They work on making sure they get a job. And now their tax money is going back to the governments, right? Because they're working. And then that tax money, a percentage of it, I can't remember, 20, 30%, I think, is paid from the government back to the facilitator of this entire pipeline. But I think we need innovative ways to see how we can be opening up the door to pathways of training with jobs at the end of it, and make it easier for people to get the training that they need.
I'll come back to Rachel. Your opening comment, you had, I think, a rather important observation tied back to what you just said, is that really what you need is not sporadic innovation, but systemic innovation, right? And what's the difference is, all right, we've created the, if you will, the best model to deliver safe drinking water to households, but then we have it's done in four different countries with 3 different communities, if you will, and it stops there. You don't know how to scale it. What do you need to scale it? You need a systemic solution that really looks at the lessons learned and then documents them and creates a process, right? And the process then leads to a platform that partners can participate in, essentially similar to what we ended up doing for education finance. So I think that's where the kind of role that NGOs can play effectively is to actually create those platforms, those ecosystems. And I'll give you examples going back within the industry that I'm familiar with, microfinance, is that, well, how did we get into banking? Well, there weren't any banks serving the poor, so we all decided to create banks for the poor, right? And starting with Muhammad Yunus in Bangladesh. There was no insurance available for bottom of the pyramid people. So my organization, Opportunity, created the first a micro insurance agency, registered it in the US and then transported it over to Africa. The trust group lending. It's that, but in all of those, what was common was that a sporadic innovation that worked. The organizations concerned got together and said, "Oh, this works. Now let's create a systemic solution around it." And I see that happening, in the field I spoke about with education finance, where what we've done is created a platform and then backed it up with massive amounts of data. And then, tremendous amounts of quality improvement methodology available both to the partners and to the school proprietors. So a lending partner can look at a database that effectively tells them for a defined set of people, what likely are your par ratios, default rates, costs of lending. How do you bring it down? Because we now have close to 15 years of data embedded in there and available. For the proprietors, we created a pathways to improvement program with 30 different disciplines of practice. What did we do? We did exactly what's happening on this conference call. We invited industry experts on everything from building codes to equity for girls in schools, and said, okay, create the platform for us, the training programs, right? We'll codify it for you, create the program. So I think those kind of collective efforts between, the private sector lending, the public sector infrastructure available, but the NGOs tying it together, where we become, in a sense, ecosystem builders, which is what I see, by the way, happening both in solar and in water, right? Is we are becoming ecosystem builders. I think that's where the real movement, COVID has accelerated. With a digital sort of foundation, and we are here in Seattle, Microsoft, from what I understand, ready to launch a massive effort at digital access and training for millions of people who are below the poverty line as we speak. So I think, to me, those are the kinds of things that start to build the systemic solutions at the bottom of the pyramid, back to including the informal economy. People, to your point, and I'll close with that, Rachel, these people cannot afford to pay market rates. Let us not fool ourselves, right? The reason they are in the informal economy and they're not in the formal economy because they can't pay to be in the formal economy. So let's not find solutions that work in the formal economy and somehow think they'll work in the informal economy. Right. So we've got to challenge ourselves to think very, very differently about both the creation of services, the delivery of services, and then what are the underlying economic models for sustainable delivery. And I think that's where, frankly, a lot of now I'm seeing innovation and creative power being applied. So that's the good news, but the challenge is very, very real.
Yeah, you touched, both of you touched on, all three of you touched on some really critical points here, both from a systemic perspective, and then how do you sort of understand contextually from the bottom up how things actually work versus, and what are the contexts that those people live in every day, people who live in a life, they're not a farmer, they're not, a family member, they have a life, and how do we think about it from that way, from their own perspective. And then this idea of education and workforce development, and what are those things and what counts toward certification. And when I worked at Microsoft, I worked in education and workforce development, and really saw informal education as being as powerful a motivator as formal education, especially in adult learning. But then often people who might learn things in a non-formal way didn't have the same opportunities as those who came from a formal education. So there's lots to unpack. Probably there's a whole semester's worth of stuff to unpack just with this one panel discussion. I'd also like to open it up to the floor now. There's a couple of questions that have come in, both related to partnerships. And Tina Sweeney asks, are there examples of leapfrogging partnerships that you've seen on a massive scale that involve public actors, private actors, and other actors, maybe development finance actors, that you could point to where there's been a massive successful partnership in this way, whether it's in your own sectors or elsewhere?
I'll just be quick. I think Gavi, right? I think things like Gavi are things we can point to as a global partnership. I think a lot of, it's interesting in the water sector, the rumblings in the corridors of conferences the last couple of years, which, I don't know that we have those now in Zoom conferences, but there's real partnership fatigue. I think the water sector since the Dublin Principles has been all about partnership. But partnership is, there's no definition for what partnership is. And there's really very little mutual accountability in partnership structures in the water sector. And so I think when we talk about, like something like Gavi, it was very clear. There was a very clear problem to be solved. Everybody had something to get out of it, right? There was mutual interest, mutual self-interest. There was funding. There were clear deadlines, clear objectives, right? And mutual accountability. And I think that's missing, at least in the water sector. I don't see a lot of that happening. I see a lot of conversations about informal collaborations, about informal regulation on behalf of corporations, right? It's all very informal and wishy-washy. And that's, I think, why people are very tired of partnership as a word. So I think we need to reclaim what partnership means and make sure that there's actually teeth to those.
Collaboration? I don't know. Maybe that's just a different phrase saying the same thing. Matt and Atul, other thoughts?
I'll give an example from, I spoke about Ghana briefly. Right now, as we speak here, we are in our Bank in Ghana opportunity, savings and loan in Ghana. We are collaborating with the MasterCard Foundation. So you got MasterCard Foundation on the one side with the private sector funds, opportunity with our civil sector approach, and then the government of Ghana's small lending bank, which is government owned on the public side. The MasterCard Foundation's made funds available to the government lender for essentially, funding in our case, opportunities lending portfolio to very small micro SMEs who've been impacted by COVID-19, where they're providing both the refinance for the portfolio and they're picking up about 80% of the credit losses if those happen. And the deal, they also created, the MasterCard Foundation, a web platform, back to high touch and high tech, a web platform for these SMEs to make applications. So, to give you a contrast, in a typical year in our banking network with, I think they have, I probably get this wrong, about 20 or 25 branches, you end up with about 40,000 odd people coming in through the doors, looking for loan applications that we complete. In 3.5 weeks, we got 98,000 applications on the web platform. Right, and we got a problem of plenty. So the team there is kind of figure out how do we process 96,000, 98,000 applications. So this is where the power of a private sector effort at making a very focused amount of money available for a very specific purpose at below market rates for people who are in the informal economy. The government lender getting involved, but recognizing they don't know who these people are. Right, we got the money, being the government lender, who knows the people? Well, the banks to service the poor, nor the people. So let's figure out how to get to the people with them, right? So that tripartite effort, I think to me, those are the kinds of examples, practical examples, where at the end of it now, thousands of very, very small micro entrepreneurs will get loans to help them survive the COVID crisis. And all this brought together in just, frankly, effectively about 6 to 8 weeks of work. I mean, it's really quite remarkable when you think about, I grew up in a developing economy and a developing country. Things don't happen in 6, 8, 10 weeks. They just don't. And you're seeing that happen. So I'll pause there, James. But that, to me, that is just, it really is exciting. I mean, very exciting to see that. I can hardly stop talking about it.
Yeah, well, I think you both have touched on sort of attributes of partnerships that are really critical. And in my day job, this is what I do a lot. And, you have to have sustainable outcomes, and they have to be locally sustainable to be successful. Too often partnerships become, the MOU is signed and organizations feel great about it. The PR happens and then it falls apart. And that's because nobody takes an intentional approach to the partnership beyond the sort of initial press briefing or whatever, and to how it actually works on the ground. How do you govern the partnership? How do you deal with conflict in the partnership? How do you deal with different perspectives of different organizations? Development organizations may have a very different timeline, different language, different objectives than private sector organizations, whether they're global or local. So I always preach kind of the intentionality of partnerships from a perspective of understanding how do you govern the partnership and how do you ensure that it becomes long-term and sustainable in and on the ground in the places where you're working. Somebody in the chat pane just said it's mission, not organization. Humility, not brand. And I think those are two good driving forces for partnership. It's about the partnership and the mission of the partnership, and not the individual organizations. That's an excellent point. And then somebody else asked, David Owens asked in the chat pane, and we touched on this a minute ago, on how can collaboration help us build more platforms? I mean, we talked a few times about platforms, whether ICT platforms, partnership platforms, engineering platforms. How can partnerships become a driving force for some of the platforms that were talked about? Matt, maybe I'll turn to you since you didn't get a chance to answer the last question.
Yeah, I was actually mired in all these experiences, and to your last point of like how important it is to have that intentionality through. So I didn't say anything, but yeah, I mean, the partnerships are so key. Some of the things that we're seeing here in North America kind of like drive to the point of that certification pathway that I was talking about is partnering with the organizations that are developing these certification pathways, and collecting that data and building the platforms of opportunity for people in the sense of demonstrating, sort of like achievement in different levels of, for example, being an educator, being a master trainer for renewable energy systems, like kind of creating these opportunities for the people who are going to be delivering the education of the future to kind of get, sort of jump the scale, if you will, or give sort of get higher education within this framework of renewable energy practitioners. And I think also, again, back to that, the opportunity, I think we have to really be working with the governments or whatever other entities or institutions in country are creating those pathways. And kind of to Atul's point, which I'm really thinking about, is like you can't use the model of the formal economies to solve informal economy issues. But I'm just wondering if there are collaborations that still can be had to create those pathways for people in informal economies that are built on old models, but maybe leapfrog different ways of thinking. And those can be really, really helpful, I think, to sort of like showing opportunity for people. So I don't know, it was a little bit skew to my thought there in my brain, but I think it's key to just kind of build on some of the models that have been working and continue to propel them and see if there's ways that we can distribute them around the world.
Rachel, Atul, any more thoughts on platforms and partnerships and how we can, scale relevance and efficacy across different regions and communities?
Okay, I'll just jump in. The one thing, this idea, just a quick comment on the intentionality. I was just jotting down a note, and I think, from where I sit in my experience in the development space, which is it's just a corner, right, of the wider experience. But this notion of like funding, I just wrote like, funding is not a sufficient intention. Your intentionality for a partnership can't be based on wanting funding, right? And yet that's so often what happens. I really appreciate, Matthew, your notion of like certification, that there's an intention for impact, right? That there's so in terms of the relevancy, but I'll be clear, right? One of the hardest parts of this funder to funded sort of gap is once you have a platform that's working, it's boring, right? Who wants to fund that? That's boring. How are you going to justify that as a program officer to your board? Like if it's, and at a certain point, I've seen so many nonprofit organizations that reach the kind of 10 to 12 million in operating budget, and nobody wants to fund them anymore because, well, why aren't they scaling to 100 million? And, what, they just get stuck. Because they're no longer sexy, right, to fund. They're not the new kid in town anymore. So we have a real, in terms of disruption and leapfrogging, it's just a human behavior thing. I think this notion of, yes, let's absolutely, have construct platforms with really short cycle timeframes, right? So the partnership is not indefinite, right? Here's what we need. Here's how, here's what's in it for you. Here's what's in it for me. And kind of keep it novel in some way, right? So rather than try and get funding for something super long, maybe start with something that's exciting and novel that continues to build, because funders get really tired and fatigued, and funders themselves, there's so many new philanthropies, so many different funders, they all kind of want to have their own brand out there. So there has to be something in it for them too. And I think we often lose sight of that. It's like, we have to think about the impact. Obviously, that's what we're all in it for. But we all have to transform together, whether that's, the funder and the funded.
I think for you kind of, there are different drivers, right, James, when it comes to what makes for effective platforms and effective partnerships, and then how do you bring those? So it's not a straightforward solution. And when you think about partners, I mean, we've got to the point that several of our attendees made already. We have to find partners who are aligned by mission, the choice of the group of people they want to impact. In our case, we call them clients, or some of you might call them beneficiaries, and what impact you want to achieve, right? What's in it for us is okay, or we progress on the mission, we make an impact on a defined group of clients, and we do that in a sustainable way. I think it's not easy to find partners like that. So, how do you invest enough amount of really thought into creating the right partnership, community, if you will. And then when you think about, and then what's for each individual, you can't deny the fact that each individual partner has got to see something for themselves, right? That it's a win-win for them. So that's sort of one part that holds back partnerships or accelerates them, presence or absence. I think on the platform side, you kind of need a different kind of set of skills than the partnering skills. So what I've learned in my own sort of management experience is, different strokes for different folks. So when it comes to creating the platform, then you actually go back to the people who have created massive scalable platforms. And many times those people actually found in industry, not within the nonprofit world. I mean, in your own example, Microsoft, in our example, education finance, the platform creation actually done by the leader there is a guy from ex-Goldman Sachs, right? A massive platform creation on a global level. So I think you have to then, as a nonprofit, be willing to look at those two separately and then bring them together. Where do you find the expertise to create platforms? Where do you find the expertise to create the partnerships? And then thirdly is a very, very deep, not just knowledge, but a very deep trust network in the local community. And I truly believe that's where the nonprofit and the group here distinguishes itself the most, and can and should. It's not in the thought leadership that we can provide. Yes, we do. It's not even in the platform building. Yes, we do. But most importantly, where we are, how do we stay, and where we are not, how do we become the trust points in the local community? And I think when you do those things is when really the proverbial sort of magic happens. And if the nonprofits fail on the trust side, no amount of solution building is going to stick. I mean, the work we do is not simple or straightforward. It's complex, but making it look simple is actually an act of genius. So here we are. So.
That's great. And a few things you said got me thinking, the idea of funding, not intention, and the trust network at the local community level, and understanding the people you're serving and what are their needs, as we've come back to a few different times. And we often advise a lot of our corporate clients not to start with the funding. Don't worry about the dollars leverage. Think about all of the other elements to that, and how do you measure return on investment beyond just the dollars. That could be network effect. It could be ways of providing technological expertise into local communities, but there has to be that local network as well. And one thing I wanted to touch on is how do you ensure that the voice of the people at the local level get heard in forums like this? Because often we're at the centers of power, Seattle, Washington, New York, Brussels, Geneva, talking about things as Westerners or people who live Western lives, and we don't hear as much from the people who are actually living those lives. And how do we get their voices to be heard more effectively? So let's ask that question. I also want to encourage others in the audience, if you want to ask questions, please put them into the chat pane. I am monitoring that. But in the meantime, let's see what the three of you think about the notion of getting the local voice, the beneficiaries, the clients, the stakeholders, the shareholders, whatever we may call them. How do we get their voice to be heard more effectively? Matt?
Yeah, invite them. I mean, I think about this a lot at conferences that we go to, and they're not there. Their voices aren't there. They're not invited. It's usually sort of the business people that are, making the industry happening, and we need to bring them there and hear their stories. And what's interesting now, potentially, about this new world of how we're engaging through technology virtually, is maybe that's opening up some opportunities for us to get creative in how we could start hearing those voices more. Yeah, like maybe it's pre-recorded videos and case studies and stories about what people are going through on the ground. Because, like, to Atul's point, and to the point that we've been putting through this whole conversation, is like the local needs and value is so important. We have to tell that story of place. And so what are the ways in which we can put an intentionality behind telling that story, behind inviting those people to these events that we gather to talk about their issues, to understand them better, so that the funders and the decision makers can hear that and feel that and understand that. We've got to be doing that more. I come back to the word of, like, intentionality. We've been saying it, like make that our intention. Find the people that we can invite to tell those stories, and start to connect the dots and the meaning for those that have the levers of power.
I have a question about that, though. So I wholeheartedly agree in theory. In practice, I also have questions, though, about who is this for? So are the funders and decision makers, what's our sort of theory of, I don't know, theory of change, theory of development, but like it's like, where's the government? So why, when I think about a public service like water, whether it's delivered by a private actor or not, it needs to be regulated by the government, who's local and regional or national, right? And so unfortunately we have this, in our session back in October, one of the participants was like, we need to dismantle. She was like, we need to dismantle colonial-led development models that have been persistent, for now hundreds of years. Bretton Woods and like the last 70 years is really just the last incarnation of colonialism, and we need to dismantle it. And it was fascinating because it's like, yeah, like, okay, so how do we do that? And, I mean, I think the thing is that opening up these kinds of conferences, absolutely. Right. But then there's like, well, why are we, like, where is the disconnect of, local organization, like local communities solving their own needs, and obviously not having the funding to be able to do that. And therefore funding equals power for some reason in this, whatever, capitalism, in this market structure that we are operating under. So like, how do we also make sure that government is also accountable to its people for public goods, right? And then what is our role as development actors or people interested in planetary health or whatever, achieving the sustainable development goals? What is actually our role? Because maybe, we also need to maybe dismantle our own power. And I don't know how we do that when you have trillions of dollars in philanthropy going into, right? When you have so much of the funding is coming from outside of the country, but we need to somehow figure out the role of government as well in that space and empowering government to do their job. But then I'm putting in all my own assumptions about what I believe government's job is. So I really do think we need to have more thoughtful conversations too about market structure for public and private goods.
Thanks, Rachel, and it's both Matthew on this. We part of I guess my industry, the microfinance industry I'm currently part of, is at its grassroots kind of slightly different in that we think of our what traditionally my nonprofits would call beneficiaries as clients. They're there because they will decide whether to purchase our services or not. We've got, our job is to create the best possible set of products and services that they would like to purchase at the price that they can afford, and then service them, right? And in that sense, the good, the bad, the ugly, today, most of the industry is regulated, and that regulation actually has been, for the most part, beneficial for both the clients and the industry. And if we had time, I could give you just the 9 months of what central banks have done in the last 9 months with COVID-19 to help the industry itself lend to the poor. So I think it's first is an inside out look. How do we think of ourselves, who we serve differently, right? They're not simply they're takers, but they actually are clients. They are active participants. And I think there's a lot to actually celebrate. We were on a Bretton Woods conversation. We could spend 20 minutes just on the Indian example of development over the last 40 years of, I'm 61 now, so I've been active participant and recipient of development services. We could talk about that, but I'll come back to, I think, just on your point about what's happening today as the people who didn't have a voice, how they're getting a voice. Back to technology, my organization, COVID-19, schools were closed. We fund about 14,640 schools. With typical schools would have anywhere from 30 to 40, if you will, staff, 350 students. So we wanted to create a way for educators to learn from each other without intervention from us on how they were coping with COVID-19 and educating their children. Remember, the children, if at all, if they have a dumb phone, they're fortunate. There's no internet, there's no Wi-Fi. Well, what we did was, and the team did, this is, thankfully, it's not a tool. The team did was they ended up creating a set of Facebook-like pages and inviting educators from around the world to participate. And we ended up with, hundreds of groups and thousands of educators who were actually teaching each other how they were responding to COVID-19, how they were engaging students, how they were redesigning their school curricula, what were the active ways to keep students engaged in classwork. We didn't have to do all this, and then it's back out there and they're implementing, right? So the Facebook actually made most of that platform available to us at no cost. So I think, to me, those are the kinds of things that when you are treating your if you will, the beneficiaries as clients, and ourselves as platform creators, the team came up with it pretty quickly, and it's off and running. And now I think those Facebook-like pages will take on a life of their own. As we start to come out of the price crisis, they will now become places where educators actually are, if you will, sharpening the iron, sharpening each other. So I go back to those examples, and I just take, James, a great celebration in that. We have been living through a pretty dark time. And these are people who have very, very, very little compared to any one of us. to survive. Most of them live hand to mouth, day to day. To be able to give those educators what for us is a simple solution, Facebook Live pages, and create a conversational platform. For them, it's something that is giving hope and encouragement and commitment, and now a confidence. By golly, I'm going to get through this. So I just, for me, that's the excitement. And I think, Rachel, to your point, frankly, I think that's the part of the nonprofit industry, is to be the point of light. Right, the people we serve have to know that we have their back. If they do, I believe not that we have accomplished our purpose, but we have gone a long, long way in building the trust network that will carry us through.
That's great, and there's some great comments in the pane as well from folks, and thanks for adding these in throughout the session. It's I hope that gets recorded as well, because I'd like to come back to some of them. And to your point earlier on necessity is the mother of invention. We when I was at Microsoft, tried to build a global teachers network, and were somewhat successful 8 or 10 years ago. And suddenly, we have COVID, and now we have the ability for people to work remotely and learn from one another about working remotely, whether it's in education or other sectors. And that drives the invention that we were trying to drive a number of years ago, and the world just wasn't quite ready for it at that time. In the last 4 minutes we have here, so I'd just love to wrap up the session. Some really interesting themes here around partnerships, around platforms, around equitable engagement from the people who are most affected by development, around changes to systems, whether they're financing systems or partnership systems or technology systems. There's so much more to unpack, and I really wish we did have more time. Maybe just to wrap things up, though, with each panelist, if in just 1 or 2 sentences, I'm putting you on the spot here because this wasn't a prepared question. What is the 1 or 2 things that give you hope coming out of COVID that we can leapfrog? And so I will first turn to Atul on that question. Just keep it short to a sentence or 2, and then to Rachel, and then to Matt.
Well, very quickly, I think what gives me hope is that we are all here. And it's all of us here together. Yeah, and we all want to make a difference. I do believe that the technology is available today than ever before. You can see it even in the vaccine development. I think it applies elsewhere. The funding is available, the will is there. And I think we have a window of opportunity to now, go through, and it'll hopefully not just be a window, but it will become one and many doors. So that's what gives me hope. It's the people, the means, the technology, the funding, and now, if you will, I'll close with the opportunity to make it happen.
Rachel.
Yeah. So for me, the things that I'm most excited by is, likewise that, we've been talking about the urgency of the SDGs and, like 10 more years or 20 more years, whatever, but there hasn't been the sense of urgency. And if we can come up with a vaccine in 9 months, or several that actually seem to be doing their job, then really we can do anything, right? And I think that we need to kind of not lose sight of what kind of a miracle. And I'm a very secular person, but it's kind of miraculous that we have so many vaccines in such a short period of time, right? Like we can actually do it. And so I think that's an opportunity. The other one is this direct engagement. I've engaged more directly by Zoom with people all over the world, not just within the water sector, but forums like these, which are then we need to continue that. We need to not just get on planes and talk with our own sectors. We need to really engage more broadly and use the technology at hand.
Great points. Matt.
Yeah, great. Those are great points. I'll keep the theme going because I definitely have hope that the innovations that we have developed over the last few decades when it comes to deploying energy access to people is just incredible, and how fast it has grown from the time I started 20 some years ago. It's like we're making leapfrogs year after year. And so the opportunity that it presents to bring energy access in creative technological ways is just tremendous, and we're going to see a big shape shift happen, I think, in energy access in the coming years. And I agree. I just have to agree with what Rachel just said about how this engagement that we're having virtually actually is allowing us to engage, I think, deeper, because we could do it without traveling, and we could have meaningful conversations and start to listen to where those collaboration points. And then the third piece is, diversity, equity, and inclusion. These things are starting finally, I think, to come to the surface of awareness of much more of a collective humanity. And we need to start to see those be at the cornerstone of our decision making, our policies, and almost every lens that we do in our work, in our budgets, et cetera. And I see that as being a game changer for the future.
Great. Thank you all. So optimism rules the day, I think, if I can summarize what everybody said coming out of this crisis, and lots that we need to work on together and with our counterparts around the world. So thanks to the three of you for participating and giving such great insights and dialogue around this. Thanks to everybody in the audience for participating as well and providing additional context and real-time comments, which we couldn't do if we were all in a room together. So it's really cool to be able to do that on Zoom. And hopefully we'll find new ways to have these forums as we go forward. That ends our session. If you are looking for your next session, go to the Whova app. You should be able to find that and join the next session as well. Thanks again to everybody for attending. And I look forward to hearing from many of you as we go forward through the next couple of days and also into 2021 and leave this 2020 year behind us. Thanks again and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you so much, James.
Thank you, everybody.
Perfect. Thanks
Bye, everyone.
to our speakers for sharing their expertise with us today. And as James said, coming up next is a short break. And then 10 minutes before the hour, in just a couple minutes from now, there will be a presentation of the 2020 Global Hero Award. You can just click on Agenda in Whova and select the session to get connected. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thanks all. Bye-bye.
Have a great day.